Hello, my name is Alexia. This is my legal history of EB education research for ELL 515. Here are my topics that I will be discussing for today. And my thesis is that the impact of colonization on language/culture have had a significant lasting impact on society, politics, and law. This in turn has led to palpable outcomes for emergent bilingual learners. My first topic for today is indigenous linguistic richness in the pre-colonial Americas. So prior to Spanish colonization, there were actually many languages spoken by the inhabitants of the Americas that had been developed over the course of centuries. They had a very rich, I guess, form of language. They had very rich oral traditions. Many indigenous communities kept a lot of their traditions alive through these oral traditions. And unfortunately, as we transition into the next slide, a lot of those languages are going to end up completely disappearing as a result of the Spanish genocide of the indigenous Americans. And the overall Spanish colonization is going to seek to assimilate those who are surviving or those who are mixed according to the Spanish case system's classification of race. So even if you were closer to indigeneity and you kept some of your language as a quote unquote mestizo, you were eventually to be assimilated and having to incorporate Spanish into your daily life and getting rid of your indigenous roots and culture and language. This leads us to eventually, after the Spanish conquest of the Americas, after Mexico gains its independence from Spain, there is a war between the United States of America and Mexico, and this is known as the Mexican-American War. And between Mexico and the United States, there is a struggle for specifically the land that Spain had acquired for Mexico, and Mexico eventually took as its own as a result of their independence. Eventually, the United States is going to win the war, and ultimately, they are going to end up annexing several states, or what we know today as the states from the United States, from Mexico. And that includes Colorado, California, the Arizona, and Utah, Nevada, among others. There was also a lot of talks of Mexican identity formation after this. There was more proud to be kind of Mexican language going on in Mexico after this war and after they had a big chunk of Mexico essentially ripped from them. And also talks of borders and border culture from the United States kind of started to form at this time into what we know today as very strict border boundaries and laws. There's also, I guess, kind of backtracking a little bit historically, colonization of not just the kind of mainlands of the continental United States and the Americas, but also colonization of other parts of the Americas, such as, or at least for the Americas of Puerto Rico, and parts of what we would consider Pacific Islanders for the Philippines. And Spanish colonization stretched all the way to there too as well, and they were colonized in the 16th century. And similar to what happened in the Americas or in the mainland Americas, there was forced labor, population declines, and also forced assimilation when it comes to religion, imposing Catholicism onto the populations. Eventually, there is a transition between transition to U.S. colonial rule, where the U.S. ends up taking, the Puerto Rico as U.S. territory to this day, and the Philippines gained its independence sometime after. For the Bilingual Education Act, or Title VII, there was this kind of act signed into law where there was a prioritization of bilingual learners because it was found that there wasn't enough resources going towards them, especially funding. And so more funding was put into English proficiency and academic success for these bilingual learners, and it kind of made bilingualism more of a common thing that the U.S. has recognized, and that's through this giant federal effort to address the needs of those bilingual learners. And we can even talk about, again, how that relates to the annexation of Mexican territory, because there was a lot of them, and they weren't actually minorities, and there are a lot of bilingual learners to the point where they should not be considered minorities. For Flores versus Arizona, this is the Supreme Court case that is going to be dealing with the educational rights of English language learners. There is going to be a criticism of Arizona's English only education programs, and eventually the Supreme Court is going to rule in favor of the plaintiffs, and that overall Arizona failed to meet federal requirements for appropriate support of ELL students. And we can even go back to that act that was signed just before, that kind of led to this decision. And the impact of Flores versus Arizona is that it set a precedent regarding the rights of ELL students and the responsibilities of educational institutions to provide support for those ELL bilingual learners. And overall, I feel like all of these events in total these all led to palpable outcomes that happened either as a result of colonization or as a result of changes within the culture of the United States. Thank you for watching my presentation, and I hope it was insightful.